Dear Professor Roth, dear audience, as a young scientist, my insider knowledge of the academic world is still rather limited. However, during the few years I've been sitting in lectures and at conferences like this, I have learned a few lessons. And the particularly important one is it is wise to use disclaimers, especially in the discourse between different disciplines. Today, I would like to make use of such a disclaimer before I comment on Professor Roth's presentation. So here's my short disclaimer. As you have learned in the introduction, I have a background in the social sciences. And in addition to that, I've also studied philosophy for a few years. Well, why do I mention something so trivial? Well, I think it's not a secret that many social scientists and philosophers are not particularly happy about the growing popularity of neurology in recent years. In fact, there's a lot of hostility against neuroscientific theories for a simple reason. Neuroscientists have started to offer explanations for many things that in the past belonged to philosophers or social scientists. So in the circles in which I normally go in and out, a title like The Neurobiology of Violence would not meet a lot of sympathy. Quite in contrast, it would probably meet a lot of criticism. Determinism, reductionism, or biologism, these are the typical accusations brought forward against neuroscientific theories. Personally, I don't like this sort of sweeping critique. It is a form of labeling and demonizing others that is not very productive. In fact, it is a rather unfair argument, since normally it is articulated without ever seriously engaging with the opponent's point of view. Of course, speaking to you today, it would be foolish to claim that I can fully forget about my own academic affiliations. It would be foolish to claim that I can silence the animal instinct in me that wants to defend my own territory. But at least I will try my best. So probably I will not be able to fully blend out these quite strong terms here, but hopefully I can put them into brackets for a short moment. And it will be up to you to judge whether it was a successful attempt or not. This being said, let me turn to the actual topic of my brief talk, violence. What do we know about violence? How can we explain why people fight, torture, or commit murder? We have learned from Professor Roth that neurophysiological dysfunctions and certain genetic dispositions seem to correlate with violent behavior. But we have also learned that early childhood experiences and certain psychodynamic mechanisms play an important role as well. These insights are based on a large number of empirical studies, and Professor Roth has quoted from them extensively. In the recent couple of weeks, I've looked into these studies in more detail. I don't have the appropriate methodological knowledge, so I'm not in the position to judge the validity of these studies. However, I made a few other observations that seem noteworthy to me, and I would like to bring them up here with the hope that they might stimulate further research. These observations concern very general questions concerning violence and how we can study it. Maybe sometimes these observations are a bit polemical, but my intention is not to question the insights Professor Roth has presented, but to point to possible directions in which they could be refined or extended. The essence of my observations can be summarized in 3 points, and as you will soon see, all 3 points are closely connected to each other. My first point is simple and straightforward. Violence can articulate in many different forms, and not all violent behavior is criminal. Yet, while I was reading through the studies Professor Roth has quoted, I had somehow the impression that neither of these both facts are taken into account by them. So, on paper, these studies talk about violence in a very general sense. But then in reality, they only focus on a very small subclass of violent behavior. They confine themselves to studying psychopaths, murderers, or rapists. what I would say, violence is a much broader phenomenon. Violence can be as dramatic as suicide bombings or school shootings. Violence can be ritualistic, like the vengeance between mafia clans, or it may remain secret and unreported, like domestic violence. Moreover, there are many forms of violence that are not socially stigmatized or defined as criminal. So the whole blue part in this diagram here, in this blue part, we would find boxers knocking each other unconscious, police officers arresting an armed suspect, soldiers killing in a war, or much less dramatic, kids fighting against each other on the schoolyard. And I don't think that we can draw a rigid line between criminal violence and non-criminal violence. I think there is a big gray zone between them. And we have learned this morning that, for instance, in Sweden, physical violence against children is defined as criminal. However, in other cultures, this might be different. So my first point is the word violence covers a broad range of different phenomena. Any theory of violence that has the ambition to explain violence in a general sense would need to account for the whole variety of violent behavior and not only for some. The whole variety. My second point directly ties into this first one. Let's assume for a moment that we would really try to account for the whole variety of violent behavior and not only for some. In other words, we would not only focus on murderers and psychopaths, but also on hooligans or rioters or policemen who, as we can see here, sometimes end up beating innocent people. If we really try to reach such a comprehensive explanation of violence, my feeling is that we would run into problems with the approach Professor Roth has presented. Yes, it is true that young males are more likely to show violent behavior than others. Yes, there is strong evidence that genetic and neurophysiological deficits correlate with aggression. Yes, it is undeniable that negative experiences during socialization can increase the likelihood to become violent. And yes, contextual factors such as poverty or unemployment play an important role as well. However, none of these factors is either a sufficient or necessary condition for violence to occur. Some women are violent as well. Some people murder, although they had a wonderful childhood. And some people might have all the different brain dysfunctions Mr. Roth has quoted without ever hurting anybody else. So my point is, statistical correlations only draw attention to associations between different variables, but they do not really tell us something about how and why violence occurs. Well, I know this is a bit an unfair argument, and I apologize for that. I'm trained in the philosophy of science, and I know how hard it is to really get that hard, bulletproof causal relations. However, there are different ways of dealing with this fundamental epistemological problem. The quest for high correlation coefficients is one of them, but not necessarily the best. There are ways of understanding violence from a completely different angle. And as my third and last point, I would like to briefly introduce such an alternative perspective. From individuals to situations, and from correlations to processes. This is, in a nutshell, the essence of the alternative perspective I would like to introduce. It requires two radical breaks with the predominant discourse about violence. First, we have to stop thinking about violence as a property of individuals. Second, we have to go beyond looking for background variables that differentiate those who are violent from those who are not. Instead, we have to start with the actual situations and contexts in which violence occurs. Such a shift of perspective has been suggested in this thick book here. It was written by Randall Collins, an American social scientist, and was published only a year ago. Collins has analyzed a large number of violent situations across many different contexts. Starting from this perspective, he discovered that all violent situations share a large number of structural properties. They articulate in clear patterns and follow specific pathways. There is situational tension. Often there are threats or insults. Fights are short and overshadowed by the fear of being hurt. These patterns and pathways apply across contexts, no matter whether we deal with hooligans, domestic violence, or let's say fights between gangs. So, in other words, in order to explain violence, it's normally enough to pay close attention to the actual situations in which it occurs, and there is no need to look for background variables like sex, age, or genetic dispositions that should explain why violence occurs. Of course, there is no doubt there are certain forms of violence that cannot be fully accounted for by circumstances only. I think, for example, especially of psychopathic serial killers. There we cannot avoid to refer to inner dispositions like brain dysfunctions. However, as Collins is pointing out in his book, the current discourse about violence tends to overgeneralize these extreme cases. In other words, we tend to project the models we have for explaining extremely violent acts on all other, less cruel forms of violence. And I think this is an important point. After all, talking about violence, we do not only deal with different models of explanations. These models are also highly political. When we explain violence, primarily in terms of innate characteristics of individuals, stigmatization and a certain fatalistic attitude are likely to follow. But if we see violence more in the light of specific situations, there is less weight on the shoulders of individuals and more space for active prevention. Yet, at the end of the day, it also means that all of us are potentially at risk to get violent, given the wrong circumstances. Thank you.
We have already an address, a question, but before I would give you the chance to recommend the comment.
Yeah. Thank you very much. This was a very good introduction to a more sociological view of aggression and violence. At the beginning of my talk, I told you that I would concentrate on criminal violence, and there are lots of studies that do not concentrate on criminal side, but on the facts you are mentioning. And I just did not talk about that, although highly interesting. And I just briefly mentioned that instrumental violence is very interesting. It is not strictly criminal, just people learn and enjoy being violent. And they can be just very peaceful. If the situation leads them to become violent, then they will be violent. This is not well studied, but this is mostly interesting. So, excuse me for my strong limitation in my talk, which was... But on the other hand, there's one factor. If you study those violence tourists, those young people who travel from one city to the other, one conference, big conference to another, there are around 1,000 German young people. Who are those tourists?
You mean the Black Bloc, for example?
Yeah. And if you study them, which has been done, it's not just the political, sociological situation, but in combination, they have a strong emotional deficit. They are sensation seekers, and they all report when fighting against the police or others, I feel at home with myself. Otherwise, I feel depressed, I feel empty. So, in combination with what you are emphasizing, the sociological, psychological, political situation, there's always the question, why those people and not others who are those tourists? So we have to solve the problem, and I fully agree that understanding the sociological dimension of violence is still far away from normal neuroscience. And the trivial reason for this is it's very difficult to conduct experiments in the laboratory with those situations.
But I hope you also saw that I made actually my critique also against my own colleagues. So for instance, if people say that poverty or unemployment leads to violence, this would be a sociological hypothesis.
Yeah.
But I said this is also not leading to what we actually want to have.
Yeah.
This does not really explain violence.
Categorization again.
Yeah.
Whenever I'm giving such lectures, I say, I'm a biologist, and I'm feeling a little bit talking against my own colleagues, emphasizing that the psychological, sociological factors are more important than the purely biological factors. Mm-hmm. If a biologist tells you this, and you should believe him, that these efforts are not effortful enough. This is just taken for granted.
First question. Can you please take the mic? Yes, there are several ones.
Oodles of mics, great. Look, I want to introduce the concept of the Pavlovian dog. Now, you have two kinds of individuals or subjects, some that are able Pavlovian dogs and others they are not. Now, the able ones are the one underneath the bell-shaped curve. By the time they are 20, they know crime doesn't pay, and the others don't learn it. Is this true, or is it simply because they weren't hit hard enough when they were Pavlovianized? Or maybe if they cannot learn, then you got to lock them away.
Well, this is a very interesting lab problem. If you read through the original early articles by Pavlov, you will discover that he took 100 dogs and tested all of them, and 30 dogs were too active in order to be used for laboratory reasons. He excluded them. Then other 30 did nothing. They would just fell asleep or they just did not respond. Only with 3 of them.
I don't want to discuss the experiments of Dr. Pavlov.
No.
I mean, we all in this room know what the word Pavlovian dog means.
Could you explain this? I do not understand now what you mean, although I'm a physiologist.
Well,
I know what conditioning is and Pavlovian conditioning is. What you mean by Pavlovian dog, I don't know.
Well, the Pavlovian dog is a dog that learns that an act by the surrounding will produce a certain result. And the Pavlovian...
This is not a Pavlovian dog, excuse me.
Pavlovian
conditioning, he does not learn to do something. Excuse me.
Can I just finish this? Now, Pavlov actually looked at the, I think it was the stomach mucosa, and each time he gave him food, the stomach mucosa would start to secrete something.
Yeah.
Now, he said, previous to giving food, I ring a bell. And indeed, the dog knew that when the bell rings, then the food comes, and then the secretion was on. Now, he left away the food. He only rang the bell. And what do you know? The mucosa started secreting juice. That is the classical Pavlovian dog. And of course, not all dogs do the same. Now, in this transposed way that I'm trying to explain is, if you are violent, this is bound to have consequences for you. If you're a good Pavlovian dog, you will find out that you will be punished each time you are violent. And you'll stop doing so for purely opportunistic reasons. But in your subjects, I don't want to call them patients, but in your subjects, there were some that started at age 2 or 3 and never learned that their acts of violence had untoward consequences. Can we...
I think you fundamentally do not distinguish between instrumental learning, which is punishment, and Pavlovian learning, which has nothing to do with punishment. It's just extinction. But on the other hand, you have to put the question, why can certain dogs and certain human beings be conditioned by the consequences of their action, which will be instrumental conditioning and not Pavlovian, and others don't? This is a fundamental question. Starting from the beginning, Pavlov discovered that at least 2/3 of the dogs could not be conditioned for one or the other reason. This is what I wanted to say. There is something in the dog that prevents them from being conditioned. This we find in the psychopath. The others have a genetic predisposition for negative conditioning. So they learn mostly early in their life that the world is traumatizing themselves. This is negative knowledge, and this imprints them very strongly.
But if you assume that there are really certain persons or certain dogs that cannot be conditioned, what do you mean then when you say that somebody is violent? I mean, then actually this person should walk around and constantly, permanently be violent, but they aren't. They are only violent in certain situations that triggers this violence.
So when we are studying a number of young males who are strongly violent, and part of them are violent only in rare cases. They are normal, but then at a moment when they walk along the street, they feel threatened and they hit other people, but then they say, I'm sorry, I didn't want this. So their deficit is that in a certain moment they misinterpret the situation. Others go out of their home to seek out for hitting people. They just have a pleasure for
intentionally.
And then they hit them and they lie down on the street, they hit them with their foot again, and it gives them a strong pleasure. These are fundamentally different people. And the third, let me continue. The third group is even more interesting. They just learn that being violent is instrumental. And if the consequences are too bad, they just leave it. Yeah.
Next question, Dennis.
Yeah, I would like to mention one issue, which is we will discuss certainly during the days many conditions affecting that and that. But I would like to make an acknowledgement to Darwin, because also mice have the same basic mechanism as the one you are dealing with. We have knocked out a certain protein, which is, among others, strongly expressed in the amygdala, and these mice acquire fear, but do not extinguish fear. Now, we have expressed the same protein in neurons only, and in both types of mice, we have anecdotic observations that there is a small group of these mice which, without conditioning, behave normally, that have aggressivity. Therefore, it's a question of, as you mentioned, a subpopulation. We don't have enough of those, let's say, type of mice to make a statistical analysis. But it seems that there, also in mice, a compensation, as you mentioned, does not take place, and possibly that epigenetic phenomena are really the cues in these type of constellations. What do you think of that?
Difficult to answer. Would you agree that there's always a combination between the polymorphic disease or the deficit?
My argument is that the basic mechanisms are not only found in primates and in Homo sapiens, but if we look carefully in lower, let's say in other animals, in invertebrates certainly, that we will be able to find, because I forgot to say something very important. These mice have been inbred for generations and generations. So one cannot argue that it is a mixed type of genetic elements which are coming together. And it means that there is enough flexibility even within a generation. Probably, that's why I mentioned epigenetic, that you will have a subpopulation which will have this type of very, let's say, extremist behavior.
Which means a stable genetic mechanism which can be controlled from outside. That is the argument. With, even
gene dosage,
for
example.
I'd like to switch to the next question, if you allowed. Oh, here, please.
Thank you. Did you find any correlation between the high vulnerability or the different vulnerability between individuals and the reaction of normal stressors or higher stressors to violence?
No, could you repeat this? I didn't understand.
Could you
The
repeat
correlation
it?
between the
Between
genetic...
vulnerability, Verletzlichkeit of the individual to a violence course of life. Is there a correlation?
Vulnerability
Vulnerability
to
the course of life. That was the question. Phew.
Well, we know that vulnerability can have two causes. One is genetic polymorphism, but
maybe that we have a language problem. Sollen wir es nochmal schnell auf Deutsch formulieren?
Also ich suche ob Sie irgendeine Korrelation gefunden haben zwischen der Verletzlichkeit eines Menschen und seiner kriminellen Entwicklung.
Seiner kriminellen Entwicklung. Well, vulnerability is composed of two factors, a genetic vulnerability, for example, deficit in the serotonin metabolism, but also deficits in the attachment experience. These both constitute an early preponderance toward becoming criminal. Then it depends on what happens next. If those people, and I'm not a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, this is what my friends telling me, after having very negative motherhood experience, find one person that can be trusted. This will repair a lot of things. This is what I found in our interviews with the young violent men. Those who had a very negative childhood, really a textbook negative childhood, they found one uncle or one grandmother, then they could become rather normal or less criminal. If they found nobody, then they really became criminal. So this is the repair mechanism, but Professor Zirpka can talk about much more about this. This is second-hand.
Probably we'll hear more about that, but I feel a little bit uneasy because now we are entering the problem of the first-person perspective and third-person perspective. So you gave the keyword of textbook behavior and this is a kind of a God's view on how on what a negative childhood is, and if you compare to the self-reports of people, for example, then you will see quite a bit of a difference sometimes of how they felt what the childhood was. So
statistically, I think, you have only
statistically, the question is really what is our reference frame?
No, in those longitudinal studies, you can look only for very severe factors, and the most severe factors, statistically, are severe maltreatment in the sense of absolute lack of care, like in Romanian or Soviet babies, or sexual abuse, or any bodily violence. These three factors, not just an angry glance or so, must be severe factors. They destroy the early trust system, and there must be another help from family or from grandmother so to somehow repair this negative experience.
Okay. Question over there.
You said quite at the beginning that violence
speak up a little bit?
Is in some way normal among males from 14 to 20 years, but there have always been male persons from 14 to 20 years. So my question is, how do you explain this dramatic increase at the moment so that these violent situations end up in murder?
we have more, 14 to 20
Pardon me?
years old. We have more people that are 14 to 20 years old. And
No,
Well,
yeah,
but there have always been persons, male persons from 14 to 20 years, and now at the moment this problem increases so that this violence changes to murder. It's not just beating people, but murdering, killing them. So when this violence is normal and has always been, why is it changing at the moment to murder?
This is also technological development. I mean, you have to need weapons to kill somebody. You cannot really kill somebody with your fists. So maybe 100 years ago, weapons were not so widespread than today's. So this would be a sociological explanation of that phenomenon.
well, I mentioned at the very beginning, when I was young at the school ground, what we did was very normal in our eyes. Nowadays it would be interpreted as being almost criminal. And of course, this is a strong political, sociological component. What is violent criminal behavior? But there is a limit. Let's say killing another person is always a
But
crime.
what about soldiers in war?
being
They also
bored.
kill, but it's accepted. You can even get a medal of honor for killing somebody in war.
Yeah, but you need two theories. And I allude to what Professor Spielmann said this morning. You have to explain that in a democratic and peaceful society, there are criminals. 90%, 95% are normal and 5% are criminal. This has to be explained. But you also have to explain why in Nazi Germany 70, 80, 90 people at least did something quasi or strictly criminal. This is a completely different question why all of us are possible murderers.
But these implicit assumptions, these are not articulated in all these studies. There is always this framework that it actually is a normal society and certain individuals deviate from this normal norm.
Alex, technical remark to your question. It's definitely based also on a development of our attitudes to use technology. So, for example, in a football stadium, very many of the young people use painkillers, opiate type, plus certain kind of bicycle clothes to get kind of insensitivity against threats. So the combination of drugs, in this case painkillers, and special clothing increases the ability to commit violent acts. So that is definitely a cultural development that we observe in our society. So then there was a question over here, or is the question directly related to that? If not, then I would like that we follow the speakers.
Only if the question is directly related to that part.
Yeah, otherwise we have the next year.
Well, I only got a question. I would like to direct my question to Professor Roth. You distinguish these two types of violence: impulsive reactive aggression and psychopathic violence, antisocial violence. But how can you explain the phenomenon of genocides? Because there a large amount of people are a part of this violence, and you can't tell me that these people have either had a traumatic experience in their youth or have some hormonal or neurobiological disorder. So how can you explain these phenomena as a neurobiologist?
So, yeah, this is addressing the question of Professor Spielmann. How could all of us become potential murderers? There is an inborn tendency in us that must be released by political and societal mechanisms. And it now depends on how refined and tricky those mechanisms are. This has been studied that so-called normal soldiers in the Nazi wars just protested and didn't want to be involved. But after 1 or 2 days or 3 days in the concentration camps, did this without any remorse. And as far as I know, the literature, and Professor Welzer probably will talk about this later, there are seductions, there are seductive factors. And one of the most important seductive factors is to be allowed to do something which under normal conditions is strictly forbidden. This is the second dominant factor. This is a drug that almost nobody can resist. Even if you have no positive consequences. In Nazi Germany, people did something which was any reward. They just did it for acting, for doing something which before was not allowed. And the most potent drug is omnipotency. You are now, and Professor Spielmann mentioned this earlier, the most potent drug is to be the king of everybody, to do with another human being, which now is not a human being anymore, to do everything with him or her. This is a pleasure of dominance, of omnipotence. And if you look into history, this can explain when you were in wars, or if a besieged city which was then conquered, all those incredible things were done in a rage. They're full of drugs, of this mental and autonomic drugs. I think a society that eventually gives people these drugs of doing something that before was strictly forbidden, and then finally this drug of omnipotence.
And that people
cannot resist anymore.
That people cannot do it normally, I think is depicted in a huge pile of literature about the psychological situation of soldiers coming back from Afghanistan or Vietnam and so on.
Not being able to adapt again to the normal way of life.
So, last question for this session, David.
Thank you. Just a brief remark, because part of my question has been tackled by the previous question and answer. But I think we should probably refer a bit back to the safety valve issue and the question, are we probably overly conscious about a very safe and probably intolerant environment against any violence? And in that sense, we probably then have this overcorrection that people, once they are allowed a space to be a bit violent, they completely overshoot. So as you mentioned, on schoolyards in your days, still in mine to some extent, we were probably allowed to do things nowadays we would not be allowed anymore. Could it be that we lack this experience, or younger people do lack this experience, even though I didn't appreciate it at all? But could it be that the Saubannerzüge we had 100 years ago were kind of a corrective element to keep a society more, I would say, resilient against extreme violence, as a safety valve, so to speak?
I'm not a prophet.
Now you have to open a political program.
Yeah. But I remember, maybe Professor Welzer knows more, I recently read or heard in television that Nazi German politicians sent very young and completely unexperienced young soldiers to Poland, which were overwhelmed by the complexity and then overreacted. So this was extremely cruel and violent. I don't know if this is true. But even you have to exploit a normal tendency to get young people even more violent and cruel than normally. So what a society has to do from the very beginning to prevent those dangerous situations by political institutions, I would say.
Answer instead of a question?
Yeah, something like an attempt of an answer, because this is a very complicated question. But the thing is, when we talk about National Socialist violence, the perpetrators or the commanders of the perpetrators had a big problem to bring the people to perform violence and to kill others.
This is true.
So this is something we have to think about. It's not, the whole action and the whole goal of these mass violence was not about being totally cruel or performing massacres. The goal was to kill as many people as possible in the shortest amount of time. So you needed to teach efficient killers, which is something totally different from aggressive behavior and all kinds of cruelty. So this is a very complicated thing. But I go into this theme tomorrow, so maybe we can stop it here.
Thank you for the last word. That gives me the chance, unfortunately, to finish this session. Gentlemen, thank you very, very much. I have a little gift for you. Thank you for attending us. Danke.